This is the third lecture in our Ideology and Politics class. Lecture 1, I dealt with what is ideology. Lecture 2, given the fact most of us in the Western world live within the matrix, we're enfolded in liberalism as an ideology, and we work out of that enfolding. We unfold that in terms of our understanding of identity, ethics, economics, politics, religion, culture, literature, all of these things. So liberalism is what we're enfolded in. So lecture 2 looked at the classical phase of liberalism that emerged in the late 15th century, philosophically with nominalism, voluntarism, looked at how the Reformation, particularly the Protestant Reformation, unlike the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation of Luther, Calvin, Anabaptists, Mennonites, Baptists, Quakers come out of this period of time, embodied some of the principles of liberalism, such as liberty, individuality, choice, agency, even though the Bible was held as the formal authority. In fact, the deeper and real authority, or the de facto authority, was in reality these principles of liberty and choice, agency, individuality, equality. And so this was the first phase of what we would call liberalism, classical liberalism, in which it was essentially laissez-faire as a set of ideas. And then, of course, the notion of hands-off, everyone has the right to think as they so choose. That then gets applied to religion, and it gets applied to the sphere of economics and many other spheres. Lecture 3, which is today, I want to look at the modern ideology of liberalism and some of the dilemmas which emerge within the ideology of modern liberalism from the 18th to the 20th centuries. But before I do that, I want to look at a couple of tensions that emerge in the 16th, 17th century, which are going to have an impact on 18th to 20th century modern liberalism, unlike classical liberalism. For we all live at periods of history, and we absorb, we internalize, whether we're consciously aware of it or not, certain ways of understanding ourselves, our identity, community, relationships. And these ideas get inside the warp and the woof of our soul, and subconsciously, unconsciously, if not consciously, they play a significant role in shaping how we understanding relationships, ourselves, the public realm, community, friendships, all these elements that make us very human on our journey. And so I want to basically linger just for a few minutes before I move a little quicker into the 18th, 20th century forms of liberalism and the dilemmas that emerge from it, because these earlier ways of being are going to have an impact on 18th to 20th century. One of the shifts that occurred in the 16th century, which has shaped much of Western civilization since then, is the conflict between the vita-contemplativa, or the contemplative way of knowing, and the active, or the vita-activa. Really up to the 16th century, certainly in the West and elements of the East, the religious contemplative vision was foundational to understanding identity, how we live, a slowing down, an ability to listen to what is the deepest and most significant parts of us versus that which is socialized, enculturated in that sense, and knowing what desires to listen to in the house of our soul, what rooms to go into and what to avoid. And within this contemplative tradition, there was a sense you don't rush uncritically into all sorts of activist directions without thought. And sadly so, what has occurred in significant elements of the Protestant Reformation, and then when it gets secularized, some of the terrible tragedies which emerge from an activist perspective, delinked from a contemplative, being rooted in the soil of the eternal and of time itself. Within the contemplative tradition, there's a commitment above all else to know the difference within between a driven self, the self that what Evelyn Underhill would say spends so much time conjugating three verbs, to want, to have, and to do, but ignores the deeper way of understanding what does it mean to be. T.S. Eliot reflects on all of this in his great work, The Four Quartets. in which he talks about finding the still point in the moving world, that place of inner silence and solitude. Now, in the modern world, we don't know what to do with silence and solitude and quietness, so then we just frantically run into some other form of busyness, and it becomes an addictive pill in that sense. Most people, they don't know what it means to be still for more than a microsecond, and it's going from what T.S. Eliot would say, going from being distracted by distraction by distractions, and then people become disengaged, or they don't know who they really are other than the product of some almost irrational drivenness. And in classical thought, there was always this distinction between your deeper self, which is quite a journey to get to know. It takes courage to go to those places, and then a more superficial self. We could distinguish between the ego and the self, the false face that we often present. We project persona-like into the world, and yet the deeper part of our being, who we know also exists. And so there is this tension. Plato will see that, the difference between the dark and the light horse, and depending, as we ride the chariot of time, depending on what horse pulls us, we're going to be taken in very different places. Augustine makes the same distinction. He uses two Latin words, caritas, one of love, and one of cupiditas, one constantly ravenously hungry for experience to fulfill a deep gnawing emptiness for meaning. And that quest for meaning only comes from going to those deeper places and being able to listen and be attentive to that. Now, in the 16th century, what happens is certainly in the older Roman Catholic tradition, as in the older Anglican or Orthodox tradition, the contemplative was the roots out of which the trunk, the leaves, the buds, blossoms, the fruit of the active life took place. But the roots of the contemplative were cut off, and it left people then defining identity by doing, accomplishing, performing. Out of this you get the Protestant work ethic and this frantic drivenness. So although on the one hand the Protestant Reformation materially in a formal way, freedom, choice, individuality, were key principles or premises, the question always is, well, free for what? Individuality for what? How do we make choices in a meaningful way if we don't even know what paths to take or what criteria to, and if all the maps are gone in that sense, and freedom is the freedom to choose whatever you want, and people choose that differently, then how can anything be held together in any significant way? And so the 16th century, you get this notion that liberty is held high, individuality, equality, choice. But the issue of human nature, which is really the taproot deeper than the principles themselves, is what does it mean to be human, and the tensions within humans between the longing for something deeper, more significant, but often we live from a more superficial and shallow place. When the contemplative is lost, something very significant is lost in what it means to be human and how we approach human nature, identity, the tensions between the shadow within and the light within, and how one lives towards what is best without becoming a victim of that which is lower or worst in terms of desire and longing. When the active takes over, what increasingly happened, for example, I could use the clash between Erasmus of the 16th century and Martin Luther. Luther slipped into very, very much a perspective of which what we may call in some ways the puzzle mind. The puzzle mind is one which there's a puzzle, we know we need to put the pieces together. To the degree we put the pieces together, we know what is right, we know what is wrong, versus Erasmus of a mystery mind and more the ambiguity in terms of understanding not only the human journey, but what that looks like in the public and political realm. And the difference between the mystery mind is that there is much ambiguity, both in the soul and society, so be very wary of being too sure of yourself on issues, versus Luther, obviously, who took the position. He knew what genuine Christianity was. He knew how to interpret the Bible in a certain way, particularly Romans and Galatians, and he was willing to split up and break, in his case, the Roman Catholic Church, and out of that comes Lutheran Christianity, and Calvin with Reformed Christianity, Anabaptist, Baptist. And so the activist wing, when it becomes cut loose from the contemplative, one can slip very, very much into the need for certainty and reality is divided into black, white, right, wrong, and any mystery or ambiguity or uncertainty is lost in the process. We can then see this played out, as I mentioned, in people like Luther and the Reformed tradition, in which divisiveness and fragmentation takes place. Everybody is committed to their particular interpretation of reality, and then they're going to divide and fragment in a variety of ways with this sense of their certainty on, in this case, obviously what authentic Christianity is going to be. But if you just secularize that, then you just get into the hot button issues of the time that we face. And that's just the secularized Lutheranism. So whether we look at the hot button issues of the alt-right or the light right or the social justice warriors, that still is coming out of that puzzle mind that can put all the pieces together, make sense of life, and then if you differ with them, and that proves how wrong a person may be, or their interpretation of politics or religion is wrong. And so this mindset that begins to emerge when the activist dims or marginalizes the contemplative then leads to increasingly so different people interpreting reality in ways in which they collide with others, in which fragmentation occurs, in which there's an inability to agree with one another. And so we can see this played out obviously in the 16th century, the sheer fragmentation of Protestant Christianity, but you just fast forward that epistemology or that way of seeing, and it's quite easy to see how today in our culture wars, how people ideologically, they diagnose what the problem is, they offer their prognosis and their means of achieving a certain goal. They have an inability to hear others, they don't know how to be attentive, they don't know how to listen, and so it's that Lutheranism very, very much at work. And so the dilemma when we look at these early principles of liberalism, the deeper question is, what is human nature? How do we understand that experientially, existentially? What is the ambiguity in trying to make sense of that? And what's the danger of those who subordinate the contemplative for the active, and then in the vita-activa, they reduce reality to formulas, to cliches, and there's certainly going to be implications of that as we move through history in terms of ideology and politics. Let me just now move forward into the 18th and 20th century and look at how that vita-activa in some ways plays itself out with issues of human nature and then these principles of liberalism, of liberty, equality, individuality, choice, agency. Three issues become prominent from the 18th to the 20th century. From the 15th to the 18th, the notion of liberty was applied to freedom of religion. And of course, you get huge fragmentation there as people understand freedom, the content of it differently. And then also what emerges is the freedom of the marketplace. And obviously, when we get into the freedom of the marketplace and the competitive individuals in the marketplace, there are some are going to be winners and there are some who are going to be losers. There are some who are going to profit. There are some who are just hewers of wood and drawers of water, and they're not going to do as well. And so some of the questions that began to emerge by the 18th, 19th century is some are freer than others economically. The CEOs of corporations, those who do very well economically, they have fared quite well in the economic sphere. But working class people who don't have the same opportunities, who don't have the same financial backing, who don't have the same education, they certainly, their equality of condition, what they were born into is not the same as if you're born into a middle, upper class, aristocratic class, and entrepreneurial class. And so the question that began to be asked by working class people is, well, we don't have the same freedom as the captains of industry, the shapers and makers of time economically. And so the attempt was made to apply these principles of liberty, choice, equality, individuality to the workplace. And this is where you get what we would call modern liberalism. in that the interest increasingly becomes just not the middle class entrepreneurs, or what we call the bourgeois class or the Philistine class, opposing the upper class, but now you get working class people saying we don't have the same liberty and freedom as you do. So they want to apply the principles that emerged in late medieval thought, Reformation, not only to the economic sphere, but to those who don't do as well in the economic sphere, the working class. So to this you begin to get the rise of trade unions, you get the rise of leftist political parties, and eventually, of course, theoretically, you get the work of Karl Marx and his important work in the distinction between the bourgeois middle class, the Philistine class, and the proletariat, the working class. So the first phase in terms of modern liberalism that comes about is applying the principles of liberty and choice to working class people, arguing they do not have the same liberty as the entrepreneurs. Or this is really, you begin to get the differences between what we call classical liberalism, which was very business oriented and off the relationship of religion and capitalism. This particular segment of society, obviously, they've done well economically, and the notion of trade unions to limit the power of the wealthy classes. You get a clash between whose liberty when it comes to economics and who should benefit. The second element of modern liberalism, or which would follow, and it's running in much the same time also, is the issue of working class people feeling their liberty has been marginalized, they've been repressed, they do all the work, and meanwhile the bourgeois class profit from the work, is the rise of feminism itself. So many women at this time, Mary Wollstonecraft, back of her, of course, earlier, and those who follow, are going to argue a lot of this liberty and equality and choice and agency is very, very much about it to serve the interest of men. But what about women, and what role can women play, and women's rights and all of this? And so the whole rise of feminism as ideology, just as the working class in terms of ideology, obviously they diagnose the problem. The working class is, as they have very much been marginalized from wealth. How do you deal with that? Do you have to form unions and political parties? And then that hopefully there's going to be a greater sense of equality emerges between working class and people who run corporations. So the women are asking the same. Where has oppression come from? They're going to argue it has something to do with male dominance, and so you get the either or. Interesting here, this is the same Luther stuff. So if you can look at the hermeneutic, or the interpretation going on, just as Luther and Calvin, and to some degree the Anabaptist Mennonites, reduced reality to an either-or way of looking at life. So for Luther, Roman Catholic Church was the problem. He was right. For Calvin, Luther didn't properly understand the Bible. Calvin did. So you break. For the Anabaptists, neither Luther nor Calvin nor the Catholic Church understood genuine Christianity, but they did. So we're into this either-or way of thinking. And so it's very important to understand this way of looking at life, the puzzle mind, which reduces reality to simplistic either or interpretive categories, plays itself into what will become the clash between the bourgeois, the proletariat, patriarchy, matriarchy. It's the same issue of the oppressor and the oppressed, the powerful and the victims. It becomes what today we see in the culture wars, cultural Marxism, or elements of postmodernism, which reduces most ideas really just to power dynamics in that sense. And of course, that particular approach misses a much more complex understanding of how things occur the way they do. But if things can be reduced that way, then a person doesn't have to think about the more complex realities of life itself. The third movement, which emerges in the 18th to the 20th century, which of course we very much are living with in the midst of today, is the environmental crisis. And many of the leading English poets, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Southey, we would call them high Tories or high romantics, acutely realized, given the fact they're Western England. England's the workshop of the world. This is the world of Adam Smith, Manchester, Liverpool, Wigan, all these places. They're making great profits, but at what expense in terms of how working class people are being treated, in terms of the environment, the sheer pollution that's taking place in terms of the soil, in terms of the sky, in terms of the water. And so the issue of the liberty of the earth itself, or the freedom of the earth, and particularly the relationship, the symbiotic relationship between humans and nature, it becomes in terms of the profit loss motive. The environment is an object that people exploit for the purpose of profit. So and again, the environmental movements, even of today, some can slip into a very simplistic interpretation of what is the cause of global warming or environmental crisis. And this is ideology also. But the three big elements then, which are important to understand in terms of what we call 18th to 20th century liberalism or modern liberalism, and you can see how this will clash with classical liberalism, elements of classical liberalism, which are very entrepreneur, and people who run their own businesses and are certainly hesitant and cautious of having unions interfere with how they're running their business, and wanting their workers to be in unions anyway, paid better wages, better benefits, whole range of things. This is going to cut into an entrepreneur's profit. So classical conservatism wants freedom of the marketplace, but they don't want freedom for workers to ask for better wages, better working conditions, more benefits, all of these sort of things. Obviously, the feminist movement is an attempt to argue the same issue, that to more or less greater extent, men have played a significant leadership role. Women have been marginalized. So whose liberty? And there's certain truths, obviously, in the issue of power and the issue of the environment. Also, it's the issue that humans have had the power to do immense damage to the environment in the name of profit. And so what's called conservatism today tends to be very hesitant, or conservative or classical liberalism in that sense, is very hesitant about unions, leftist parties, and depending on how conservative a person is, the role of women in leadership of religion, the role of women in leadership in a whole variety of areas. And then also, if a person is an entrepreneur, they're going to have a certain attitude towards the environment, because they're making profit from the environment. And so they're going to interpret global warming in a way that's quite different than some of the hard facts which science is presenting to us. Now, these three content issues of what we would call modern liberalism, working class rights, feminism, and then environmental issues, which emerge in the late 18th century and come to grow in an accelerated way in the 19th. There are always the issues, how is one to approach that ideologically? Because if one slips into this sort of the Lutheran, Calvinist, Anabaptist, simplistic either-or categories of oppressed, oppressor, powerful, victim, it's very hard to have a discussion with people in any meaningful way if they're reduced intellectual categories to a fairly elementary analysis of what has caused the problem. And so we can also see this particular epistemological approach very much at work in, as I mentioned earlier, some of the culture wars we face with today, either the social justice warriors or cultural Marxists that want to reduce complex issues of economics, racism, environmental issues, identity politics, feminism, intersectionality, texts of history, to simple either-or dynamics. The right does exactly the same thing. They just want to reduce the problems we face in our world to simple black and white categories. Is a religion the problem? Is the state the problem? Is leftist liberalism the problem? And so it becomes comic book almost in the way people approach things. And this is quite, if we can draw from two sources, then the Erasminian tradition, which would recognize there are serious ambiguities in how we make sense of historic and contemporary realities, the ability to listen and to heed versus to pronounce simplistic answers to complex problems. And so there are these two things we have to look at in terms of the ideology of modern liberalism and then the dilemmas. I might also add, as you go forward in this particular direction, not only is there the working class issue, the feminist, and the environmental, but this is all 1789 and leading up, obviously, 18th century French Revolution. The French Revolution is very pivotal in this simplistic way of looking at why injustices occur, who's to blame for it, and what's the resolution, and the terrible violence which emerges in the 1789 revolution. And previous to that, the American Revolution of 1776. The historic state's the problem, the historic church is the problem. So that's how the diagnosis, the prognosis, we have to leave that because there can be no reformation, and then the New Jerusalem, which forms the United States. So not only do we have issues in terms of modern liberalism and the principles underneath it, there's certain ways of interpreting reality. We could see it as Puritanism not in terms of the theological Puritans, but we're the pure ones, and if people disagree with us, that proves they're wrong in that sense. We'll be visiting Gnosticism later in the course, as Gnostics historically, or the Greek word in comparison to agnostic, are the ones who know. And so a lot of, whether French Revolution, American Revolution, and certain ways of interpreting the whole feminist issue, and we'll get into contested feminisms, contested environmentalism, contested workers' rights as we go along. But it's important to know we have the issues on the one hand, of which the principles of liberalism are key, but there's also ways of interpreting these issues which divide things into light, darkness, black, right, who's right, who's wrong, and then the terrible treatment of people who don't seem to belong to the tribe or the inner ring. And of course, out of this later comes the Communist Revolution of 1917, which continues that almost secularized Lutheran direction. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, who comes from a German Lutheran background, also thinks, say, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, in simple aphoristic categories: black, right, right, wrong. And so in that sense, he shares that Lutheran, obviously the content is different, but the way of thinking is an explosive dualism in that sense, and there's implications for it. So in terms of modern liberalism, 18th to 20th century, we can see the good of these principles in terms of trying to overcome certain injustices, but also the dangers built into a certain understanding of liberty, choice, freedom, as it plays itself out in a variety of directions, and often the clashes within liberals in terms of how they make sense of the feminist issue, working class issues, environmental issues, and then some of the big political issues such as the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and then communism itself as it erupts in 1917, and the sheer violence that comes from that. So one must always be careful in dealing with the difficult issues, is that simplistic categories don't come to dominate, and then the terrible implications that emerge from that in terms of lost lives, broken relationships, and the ideals, the high ideals of liberalism become dim and dismissed as people collide with one another and destroy one another in terms of what they say and what they do and what they think. And so this is just, again, a brief overview. If you can be reading chapters 2 and 3 in the book by Weatherly that deal with liberalism and conservatism. But we can see the principles of liberalism now playing themselves out, which began in philosophy, move on to religion, the clash between religion and science, and then the application of those principles to the marketplace. But when we hear the word laissez-faire, that's just not about economics. It's also about hands-off. People can think and do as they wish. And what happens in terms of when people define the content of their freedom very, very differently. We'll look at some of that as we move forward into, say, late modern and particularly postmodern thought, when the language of freedom and liberty and agency become, rather than say the Bible becomes a source of the authority or the state, it increasingly becomes just how I define my identity. We define it differently. Or how does one hold anything together when all is contract and people can use their freedom as they want based on how they think or feel at any given time? So there's this great appeal of elements of the principles of liberalism, but also being acutely aware of its Achilles heels, its blind spots. And this is where you go back to Plato and Augustine, realizing be careful of how we understand desires and longing, because we may be listening to the wrong ones, and there are serious implications of that, both for human relationships, politics, religion, literature, culture, civilization, and many other aspects of the human journey.